I didn't knock because the moment I saw my suitcases lined up neatly on the porch, I understood that whatever waited behind that door was no longer mine. The afternoon sun hit the front steps just the way it always had, warm and golden, like nothing had changed, like this was still the same home where I had planted roses along the walkway and painted the shutters a soft blue every spring. But the lock on the door caught the light differently, shinier, newer, unfamiliar, and in my hand, the key I had carried for over 20 years suddenly felt like it belonged to a stranger. I stood there longer than I'd like to admit, not moving, just letting the quiet settle around me, the kind of quiet that presses into your chest until you realize it isn't peaceful at all, it's hollow. And I noticed small things first, the way one suitcase was slightly unzipped as if someone had checked inside, the way my winter coat was folded on top even though it was early May, the way my gardening gloves were tucked into the side pocket like an afterthought. No note, no explanation, just my life packed up and placed outside like a delivery no one wanted to accept. I looked at the door again, at the polished brass handle I had chosen myself from a hardware store 3 towns over because I wanted something sturdy, something that would last, and I remembered standing there years ago with my husband, measuring the frame, arguing gently about finishes, laughing when we realized we'd forgotten to bring the right screwdriver, and for a second I could almost hear his voice telling me not to worry, that everything would work out the way it was supposed to. But he'd been gone for 6 years now, and the house had grown quieter with each passing season, until the silence was eventually filled by new voices, new routines, new rules that I hadn't quite agreed to but had learned to live around. I turned the key anyway, out of habit more than hope, and it stopped halfway, refusing to turn, a small final confirmation of something I already knew but hadn't said out loud yet. The lock had been changed. I pulled the key out slowly, examining it like it might suddenly explain itself, like it might tell me when it had stopped belonging here, but of course it didn't. It was just metal worn smooth from years of use, now useless in a place it once opened without question. I didn't call out. I didn't ring the bell. Through the front window I could see movement, a shadow crossing the hallway, familiar furniture arranged just as I had left it, except now it felt staged, like a set built to resemble my life rather than hold it. And I wondered briefly how long it had taken them to decide this, how many conversations had happened in rooms I paid for, at a table I had set, while I was away for just 3 days visiting an old friend. 3 days. That's all it took for everything to change. I set my purse down on top of the largest suitcase and sat beside it on the wooden bench my husband had built the summer before Daniel left for college, running my fingers along the edge where the varnish had worn thin, grounding myself in something real, something that hadn't been replaced. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and something else, something distant like rain that hadn't reached us yet. And I realized then that this didn't start today, not with the bags, not with the lock, not even with the silence behind that door. This had been building quietly, patiently, in the spaces between conversations, in the way Ashley would smile just a second too long, in the way Daniel stopped meeting my eyes when certain topics came up, in the way decisions about the house were made without ever quite including me. I had seen it, piece by piece, and told myself it was nothing, that families change, that I should adjust, that keeping the peace was more important than asking questions that might lead somewhere uncomfortable. Sitting there on that bench with my entire life packed into 2 suitcases and a door that no longer recognized me, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost cold. The lock was new, but the decision behind it was not, and for the first time I allowed myself to wonder not how I had lost my home, but when they had decided it was no longer mine. I stayed on that bench until the sun shifted just enough to cast a shadow across the porch, the kind that usually meant it was time to start dinner, and for a brief moment my body almost followed the old routine, as if muscle memory could override reality, as if I could stand up, walk inside, and find everything waiting exactly where it had always been. But instead I reached for my phone and held it in my hand without unlocking it, staring at the screen like it might light up on its own with an explanation that would make sense of all this. It did not. No missed calls. No messages. Just the same quiet that had greeted me when I pulled into the driveway. I thought about calling Daniel, but the idea settled heavily in my chest, not because I did not want answers, but because I was no longer sure which version of him would answer the phone, the son who used to sit at this very porch asking me if I thought he would ever be ready for the world, or the man who had learned to look past me as if I were something temporary, something that would eventually move aside on its own. I unlocked the screen anyway and scrolled through old messages, small fragments of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else, reminders about groceries, a photo of the backyard after we planted tomatoes last summer, A short message from Ashley thanking me for watching the house while they were away months ago, polite, careful, almost too perfect, and I remembered how I had smiled at that message, thinking it was a sign that things were settling, that we were finding our rhythm as a family. Looking back, I realized it was not warmth I had seen but precision. She had always been precise. Every word measured, every gesture timed, never loud, never openly confrontational. Just small adjustments that slowly shifted the balance of the house until one day you looked around and realized nothing felt quite the same anymore. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, not close enough to draw attention, just enough to see the reflection of the living room lamp I had bought years ago, still standing in the same corner, still casting that soft yellow light I used to keep on for Daniel when he came home late. And for a second I wondered if he noticed it at all now, if he ever thought about who had placed it there or why. A faint sound came from inside, footsteps, then a pause, and I held my breath without meaning to, as if the house itself might acknowledge me. But the curtain shifted only slightly before settling back into place, and whatever movement had been there disappeared as quietly as it came. I stepped back and looked down at my suitcases again, at the neatness of it all, and that was when it struck me the hardest, not the act itself but the care behind it, because this was not anger, this was not chaos. This was a decision made calmly, executed cleanly, without hesitation, and that kind of certainty does not happen overnight. I thought about the past few months, the small changes I had dismissed, Ashley reorganizing the kitchen without asking, Daniel mentioning paperwork I did not remember signing, the day the mail stopped coming directly to my name and started arriving addressed to both of them instead. Little things that seemed harmless at the time, easy to overlook if you told yourself that families evolve and roles shift. I had told myself that more than once. I picked up one of the suitcases and felt its weight, heavier than I expected, as if it carried more than just clothes and documents, as if it held every moment I had chosen not to question, every silence I had accepted in the name of keeping peace, and I realized then that what I was holding was not just what they had packed for me, it was everything I had allowed to happen without asking why. I set the suitcase back down carefully and straightened it, aligning it with the others, restoring the order they had left, not because I agreed with it, but because I was beginning to understand something I had not fully seen before, that whatever this was, it had been planned, and if it had been planned, then it could be undone, not with noise, not with anger, but with the same quiet certainty they had used against me, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt something shift inside me. Not panic, not sadness, but clarity, the kind that comes when you stop asking what just happened and start asking what comes next. I did not reach for the door again after that, because something in me had already stepped back, not physically, but in a way that felt more permanent, like I was no longer trying to get back inside but beginning to see the house for what it had become without me, and I found myself walking slowly down the porch steps, not in a rush, not with any clear destination, just letting my feet follow the familiar path along the front yard where the grass was cut a little shorter than I usually kept it. Another small detail that told me someone else had taken over decisions I once made. Without thinking, I paused near the edge of the driveway and turned around one more time, not to check if anything had changed, but to look at it fully, the windows, the roofline, the small crack near the corner of the garage that Daniel and I had patched together years ago on a Saturday morning, laughing because we had no idea what we were doing and still managed to make it hold, and I realized then that every part of that house carried a memory that belonged to me, even if the people inside no longer did. The realization did not hurt the way I expected it to. It did not come with a sharp edge or a sudden weight. It settled quietly, like dust in a room that had not been opened in a long time. And I understood that what they had done was not just about space or ownership, it was about rewriting something they believed I would not question. I walked back to my car and opened the trunk, placing the smaller suitcase inside first, then the larger one, taking care to position them neatly, the same way I used to organize everything in the house, out of habit, out of respect for order even when everything else felt out of place. And as I closed the trunk, I noticed my reflection faintly in the rear window, older than I remembered, yes, but not fragile, not the way Ashley had once described me in a conversation she thought I could not hear, her voice soft but certain, saying that I needed help, that I should not be handling things on my own anymore. I had let that comment pass at the time, brushing it aside as concern, but standing there now, I could hear it differently, not as care, but as preparation. Quiet introduction to the idea that I was no longer capable, no longer central, no longer necessary. I got into the driver's seat and rested my hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine, letting the silence of the car wrap around me. A different kind of quiet than the one outside. This one more contained, more manageable, and I began to trace back the moments that led here. Not emotionally but carefully, like following a line on a map. The paperwork Daniel had mentioned a few months ago, the one he said was just a routine update, something about taxes or insurance, the way he had avoided specifics when I asked, the way Ashley had stepped in to explain instead, her tone calm, reassuring, almost rehearsed. I had signed where they told me to sign, trusting that it was simpler to keep things moving than to slow everything down with questions that might make them uncomfortable. I sat there and let that memory settle, not with regret but with recognition, because the pieces were no longer scattered. They were starting to align in a way that made sense, and for the first time I considered the possibility that whatever they believed they had secured might not be as complete as they thought. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small folder I always carried, the one I had organized years ago after my husband passed, filled with copies of documents, notes, and details I never liked leaving entirely in someone else's hands, and I opened it slowly, flipping through pages I had not looked at in months, until I found what I was looking for. A document that still bore my name clearly, firmly, without any additions or alterations, and I felt that same quiet clarity return, stronger. This time steadier, because while they had changed the lock, while they had moved my belongings and closed the door, they had not erased everything, not yet, and as I closed the folder and placed it back in my purse, I understood that the next step was not about forcing my way back inside. It was about letting them believe they had already won, at least for now, because sometimes the most effective move is the one no one sees coming. And I had spent enough years in that house to know exactly where to begin. I started the engine only after I had decided that I would not look back again, because there is a difference between remembering something and asking it to take you back, and I was no longer interested in asking, so I pulled out of the driveway slowly, carefully, the way I always had, checking both sides of the street even though I knew this neighborhood by heart, and as the house moved out of view in the rearview mirror, it did not feel like I was leaving it behind, it felt like I was stepping out of a version of my life that had already ended without my permission. I drove without turning on the radio, letting the quiet stay with me, not as something heavy, but as something clear, because for the first time in a long while, there was no one else's voice filling the space, no subtle corrections, no careful suggestions disguised as concern, just the steady sound of the road and the rhythm of my own thoughts beginning to organize themselves into something purposeful. I thought about where to go, and the answer came to me without hesitation, not out of desperation but out of memory, a small office downtown 3 blocks from the courthouse, a place I had not visited in over 5 years but had never quite forgotten, because it was one of the last places my husband and I had sat together discussing what would happen after we were gone, not in a fearful way but in a practical one, the kind of conversation you have when you believe you are preparing things correctly so no one else has to struggle later. I remembered the way he had insisted on keeping copies, on making sure that nothing was left vague, nothing left open to interpretation, and at the time I had thought he was being overly cautious, maybe even a little stubborn, but now as I drove toward that office, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude for a kind of foresight I had not fully appreciated before. The building looked the same when I arrived, modest, clean, the sign near the entrance slightly faded but still readable, and I parked across the street for a moment before getting out, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to step into that space with the same calm certainty I had felt growing inside me since I left the house. When I finally walked in, the air smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, familiar in a way that did not require explanation, and the receptionist looked up with a polite smile that shifted into recognition after a second longer than usual, as if she was searching through a memory she had not accessed in years. I gave my name clearly, without hesitation, and waited as she checked something on her computer, her expression changing subtly, not alarmed, not surprised, just attentive, like she understood that this visit was not casual. She asked me to take a seat, and I did, placing my purse beside me, my hand resting lightly on it, feeling the outline of the folder inside, a small but steady reminder that I had not come here empty-handed. The waiting room was quiet, the kind of quiet that holds decisions rather than questions, and I watched as people came and went, each carrying their own version of something unresolved, something they were trying to put into order. After a few minutes, a door opened and a man stepped out, older now, his hair more gray than I remembered, but his posture the same, straight, composed, and when his eyes met mine, there was no hesitation in his recognition. He said my name as if it had been set aside carefully and brought back exactly when it was needed, and I stood up to meet him, not rushing, not explaining, just stepping forward with the understanding that whatever had been put in place years ago was about to matter more than it ever had before. He led me into his office, closed the door behind us, and gestured for me to sit, and for a moment neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because some conversations do not begin with words, they begin with acknowledgement, and when he finally asked me what had brought me back, I did not describe the suitcases or the lock or the silence behind the door. I simply opened my purse, took out the folder, and placed it on the desk between us, because this was no longer about what had been done to me. It was about what had already been set in motion long before any of them realized it mattered. He did not open the folder right away, and I noticed that the way his hand rested lightly on the cover without lifting it, as if he already understood that whatever was inside did not need to be rushed, and that kind of restraint told me more than any immediate reaction could have, because it meant he remembered not just me, but the way we had handled things before, carefully, deliberately, without leaving space for confusion. He leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at me, not with sympathy, not with surprise, but with a quiet attentiveness that made it easier to speak without explaining too much. And when he finally asked if anything had changed since the last time we reviewed these documents, I found myself shaking my head slowly because the truth was nothing had changed on paper, only in the way it was being used. He nodded once, then opened the folder, turning the pages with a familiarity that suggested he had seen them before, or at least knew what he was looking for. And as he scanned the contents, I watched his expression carefully, not searching for reassurance, but for confirmation, a small shift, a pause, something that would tell me whether what I believed to be true was still standing where it had always been. When he reached the page I had marked years ago, the one my husband insisted we keep separate and clearly defined, his fingers stopped for just a moment, and that was enough. He adjusted his glasses, read the paragraph again more slowly, and then looked up at me with a clarity that felt almost steadying, as if the room itself had settled into place. He asked me one question, simple, direct, whether I had signed anything recently that transferred ownership or altered the terms outlined here. And I thought back to the paperwork Daniel had brought me, the one he had described so casually, and I answered honestly that I had signed something, but I had not been given a full explanation, and I had not seen any document that replaced what we had originally established. He listened without interrupting, then closed the folder gently, not with finality, but with intention, and placed his hand on top of it as if to keep everything exactly where it belonged. He explained, in a tone that was calm but precise, that documents like this do not disappear simply because someone assumes they have, that ownership, especially when structured the way we had arranged it, does not shift without very specific actions, actions that leave a trail, that require verification, that cannot be quietly replaced without consequence. I did not feel relief in that moment, not in the way I might have expected, because this was not about being comforted, it was about understanding, and what I understood now was that whatever Daniel and Ashley believed they had secured was, at best, incomplete, and at worst, built on an assumption that no one would question them. He asked me if I wanted him to review any recent filings, any changes that might have been recorded without my knowledge, and I agreed, not out of urgency but out of clarity, because this was no longer about reacting. It was about confirming every piece of the structure they thought they controlled. He stood, walked over to a cabinet, and pulled out a file system that looked older than both of us, yet organized with a precision that had clearly been maintained over the years, and as he began searching I sat quietly, my hands resting in my lap, feeling a steadiness I had not felt earlier that day, because for the first time since I saw my suitcases on that porch, I was no longer standing outside something I did not understand. I was sitting inside a process that was built to reveal exactly what had been done and what had not. After a few minutes, he returned with a set of documents, placing them carefully on the desk, and as he began to go through them, explaining each entry, each date, each signature, I followed along, not as someone being guided, but as someone remembering, because the names, the structure, the language, it was all familiar, and the more he spoke, the clearer it became that while something had indeed been attempted, it had not been completed in the way they believed, and that realization did not bring anger, it brought something quieter, something more controlled, because I understood now that the situation was not as final as it appeared, and that meant I had time not to argue, not to confront, but to move forward in a way they had not prepared for. He did not rush through the rest of the documents, and I appreciated that, because every page he turned felt like another layer being pulled back, not dramatically, not with any sudden revelation, but with a steady precision that made it impossible to ignore what had actually been done versus what had only been assumed. He pointed out dates that did not align, signatures that appeared where they should not have, and more importantly, the absence of filings that would have been required if a full transfer had taken place, and as he spoke, I began to see the outline of something incomplete, something that had been started but not finished, like a door that had been closed without being locked properly. He explained that while certain permissions might have been granted through the document I had signed, those permissions did not equal ownership, and they certainly did not override the structure that had been established years earlier, a structure designed specifically to prevent decisions like this from being made without full awareness and agreement. I listened carefully, not interrupting, letting each detail settle into place, because this was not a moment for emotion, it was a moment for clarity, and clarity has a way of quieting everything else. When he finished reviewing the last page, he placed the documents side by side, original and recent, creating a contrast that was impossible to miss, and then he looked at me again, not asking what I wanted to do but waiting, as if he already understood that I would not respond impulsively. I took a breath, slow and even, and asked him what steps would be necessary to ensure that everything remained exactly as it was intended, not altered, not assumed, but legally and visibly intact. He nodded, as if that was the question he had expected, and began outlining the process, simple on the surface but deliberate in execution, steps that would not create conflict, but would quietly re-establish boundaries that had been crossed without proper authority. There would be notices, confirmations, formal acknowledgments, nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational, just a series of actions that would bring everything back into alignment with what was already in place. As he spoke, I realized that this was not about taking something back, it was about making visible what had never actually been lost. I agreed to move forward, not with urgency but with intention, and he began preparing the necessary paperwork, his movements calm, practiced, as if he had done this many times before, though perhaps not for me, not in this context. While he worked, I sat quietly, my thoughts no longer scattered, but focused, moving ahead rather than circling around what had already happened. I thought about the house again, not as something I needed to return to immediately, but as something that would soon have to recognize what it had always been, regardless of who stood inside it at the moment. When he handed me the first document to review, I read it carefully, every line, every clause, not because I doubted it, but because I understood now how easily assumptions can replace attention if you allow them to. I signed where it was necessary, my hand steady, the pen moving across the page without hesitation, and as I placed it back on the desk, I felt a quiet sense of completion, not an ending, but the beginning of something that had been waiting for the right moment to unfold. He assured me that the process would not take long, that certain notices would be delivered within a matter of days, and that once they were, any misunderstanding about control or ownership would no longer be sustainable. I thanked him, not out of relief but out of recognition, because this was never about being saved, it was about remembering that I had never been as powerless as they believed. When I stood to leave, I carried the folder with me again, but it felt different now, not heavier, not lighter, just certain, like something that no longer needed to be questioned. As I walked out of the office and into the late afternoon light, I did not feel like I was returning to confront anything. I felt like I was moving forward to let something unfold on its own, because sometimes the strongest response is not the one that pushes back immediately, but the one that allows the truth to arrive exactly where it is needed, without warning, without noise, and without any room left for denial. The drive back felt different, not because the road had changed, but because I was no longer carrying the same questions with me. And when you remove uncertainty, even familiar streets begin to feel quieter, more defined, like everything is exactly where it should be whether you noticed it before or not. I did not go straight to the house, not yet, because there was no need to arrive early when I already knew the outcome would unfold on its own time, so instead I stopped at a small cafe a few blocks away, one I used to visit years ago when the house felt too full and I needed a moment to think, and I sat by the window with a cup of coffee I barely touched, watching people pass by without really seeing them, my attention resting somewhere between the present and what was about to happen. I thought about Daniel, not as he was now, but as he had been, the boy who used to run down that same street with scraped knees and endless questions, the one who once told me he would never let anything happen to me, and I did not feel anger toward him, not in the way people might expect, because anger requires a kind of closeness that had already faded. What I felt instead was a quiet recognition that somewhere along the way, he had chosen a different center, a different gravity, and I had allowed that shift to happen without asking where it would lead. I finished the coffee eventually, more out of habit than desire, and when I stepped outside, the air had cooled slightly, the light softer now, the kind that makes everything look settled even when it is not, and I checked my phone for the first time since leaving the office, not expecting anything, but finding exactly what I thought I would, a missed call, then another, both from Daniel, followed by a message that was short, almost too controlled, asking where I was and if I had come back yet. I did not respond immediately. I let the message sit there, not as a form of resistance but because I understood something he did not, that the timing no longer belonged to him. I got back into my car and drove toward the house, slower this time, not out of hesitation, but because there was nothing left to rush toward, and as I turned onto the street, I noticed a car parked in front that had not been there earlier, a familiar one, Ashley's, positioned neatly as always, aligned perfectly with the curb, as if even that small detail mattered to her. I parked across the street instead of pulling into the driveway, choosing distance over proximity, and from where I sat, I could see the front door clearly, still closed, still carrying that same polished lock that had once stopped my key, and I waited not for long, just enough to let the moment settle into place. After a minute, the door opened and Daniel stepped out, looking around in a way that was not casual, not relaxed, his posture slightly tense, his eyes scanning the street until they landed on my car, and for a brief second, we simply looked at each other from a distance that felt larger than it was. He started walking toward me, quickly at first, then slowing as he got closer, as if he was trying to decide what version of this moment he was stepping into, and when he reached the driver's side window, I lowered it just enough to hear him without inviting more than necessary. He asked me where I had been, his voice controlled but uneven at the edges, and I answered simply, telling him I had taken care of a few things, nothing more, nothing less, because explanations were no longer something I owed in the same way. He hesitated, then mentioned the house, the locks, offering a brief explanation that sounded prepared, something about safety, about making changes while I was away to avoid inconvenience, and I listened without interrupting, not because I believed it, but because I wanted to hear how far he would go with something he already knew was incomplete. When he finished, there was a silence between us, not awkward, not heavy, just clear, and I nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, and told him that I understood, which was true, just not in the way he expected. He seemed relieved for a moment, as if he thought the conversation would end there, as if everything would remain exactly as they had arranged it, and I let that belief sit with him, because what was coming next did not need to be announced, it only needed to arrive, and as I raised the window and started the engine again, I caught a final glimpse of him standing there, uncertain now, watching as I drove away, still holding on to a version of control that was already beginning to slip in ways he could not yet see. The next morning arrived without urgency, and I let it, waking up. Not to an alarm or a plan, but to a quiet certainty that things were already in motion whether I stood in front of them or not, and I moved through the small routine of the day with a steadiness that had nothing to do with habit and everything to do with clarity, making coffee, sitting by the window, watching the light settle across the table in a way that reminded me that time does not rush for anyone, it simply continues, and eventually, everything aligns with it whether we are ready or not. I did not need to check my phone to know that something had shifted, but when I did, the change was there, subtle but unmistakable, a new message, not from Daniel this time, but from Ashley, short, formal and carefully worded, asking if we could talk, which in itself told me more than anything she might have said directly, because she had never been the one to reach out first, not unless something had already begun to move beyond her control. I read the message once, then set the phone down without responding, not out of avoidance, but because I understood that timing had become the most important element in everything that followed, and responding too soon would only give them something to hold on to before they fully understood what was happening. By midday, another message came, this time longer, less controlled, asking where I was staying, if I was coming back, if we could work things out, and I noticed the shift in language from certainty to negotiation, from control to uncertainty, and I did not feel satisfaction in that change, only recognition, because it confirmed what I had already begun to see, that the structure they believed they had built was not holding the way they expected. I left the apartment in the early afternoon, not because I needed to go anywhere specific, but because I wanted to be moving when things began to unfold, and as I drove through familiar streets, I found myself observing details I had overlooked before, small businesses opening their doors, people carrying on with their routines, everything continuing without interruption, and it reminded me that no single event, no matter how personal, ever stops the world from moving forward. It only changes how we move within it. When my phone rang again, I knew before looking that it would be Daniel, and when I answered I could hear the difference immediately, not in what he said but in how he said it, the confidence from the day before replaced with something quieter, something uncertain, as he asked me if I had received anything, any notices, any calls, and I answered honestly, telling him that I had taken care of what I needed to, nothing more, nothing less, and there was a pause on the other end, longer this time, as if he was trying to understand something that did not fit into the version of events he had been holding on to. He mentioned a letter, something delivered that morning, something official, and I could hear the way he struggled to keep his voice steady as he described it without fully explaining it, as if saying too much would make it more real, and I listened, not correcting him, not guiding him, just letting him speak until the weight of it settled on its own. When he finally asked me what it meant, I told him the truth in the simplest way possible, that it meant everything was exactly as it had always been, and that sometimes what people assume to be final is only the beginning of understanding what was never theirs to change. He did not respond right away, and in that silence I could almost hear the shift happening, the moment when assumption meets reality and has nowhere left to go. And when he finally spoke again, it was not with explanations or justifications, but with a question, asking if we could meet, and I agreed, not because I needed to, but because I knew that some realizations require presence, not for confrontation, but for clarity that cannot be avoided. As I ended the call and continued driving, I did not feel like I was returning to something unresolved. I felt like I was approaching a moment that had already been decided long before any of us fully understood it, and for the first time since this began, I was not preparing for what might happen. I was simply allowing what had been set in motion to arrive exactly where it needed to. We chose a place that was neutral, a quiet restaurant just outside the neighborhood where the noise of familiarity would not interfere with what needed to be said. And when I arrived, Daniel was already there, seated near the window, his posture straight but his hands resting too still on the table, as if movement itself might disrupt whatever control he was trying to maintain. And across from him sat Ashley, composed as always, but with a tension in her expression that had not been there before, something subtle, something that revealed itself only if you knew where to look. I walked toward them without hesitation, not because I felt stronger than before, but because there was nothing left to question, and as I took my seat, neither of them spoke right away, as if they were waiting for me to begin, as if this moment still belonged to me in a way they had not fully considered until now. Daniel was the first to break the silence, his voice quieter than usual, explaining again about the letter, about the notice they had received that morning, about how it did not make sense, how the house, according to what they believed, should have been under a different arrangement, and I listened, not interrupting, not correcting, just allowing him to lay out the version of reality he had been holding on to until it reached the point where it could no longer sustain itself. Ashley followed, her tone measured, more controlled, but with an urgency beneath it that she could not fully hide, asking for clarification, asking how things had been structured, suggesting that there must have been a misunderstanding somewhere. And I could see in the way she spoke that this was not about confusion, it was about the sudden absence of certainty, the realization that something they had assumed was settled had never been within their control to begin with. I folded my hands on the table and looked at them both, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a calm that came from understanding something fully, and I explained in the simplest terms possible that the house had always remained exactly where it was, legally, structurally, and intentionally, and that no change of locks, no assumptions, and no private decisions made in my absence could alter what had been established long before any of this had unfolded. Daniel frowned slightly, trying to process what I was saying, asking why I had never mentioned it, why I had allowed things to move forward the way they had, and I answered honestly, telling him that sometimes people reveal their intentions not when they are questioned, but when they believe no one is watching, and that I had needed to see where those intentions would lead without interference. Ashley shifted in her seat, her composure beginning to fracture just slightly, asking what that meant for them now, what they were supposed to do. And I told her the truth again without embellishment, that what it meant was simple, that the house was not theirs to control, that access to it had never been theirs to restrict, and that decisions about it would return to where they had always belonged. There was a long pause after that, one that stretched beyond discomfort into something more final, and I could see the moment when both of them understood not just the facts, but the implications, the shift from assumption to reality settling into place in a way that could not be undone. Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression no longer defensive but uncertain, as if he was seeing something clearly for the first time, and Ashley remained still, her eyes focused on the table for a brief second before she looked back up, searching for something that was no longer there to find. I stood up then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with a quiet sense of completion, and as I reached for my bag, I told them that there would be time to decide what came next, but that for now what mattered was understanding what had already been set in place, and that understanding does not come from resistance, it comes from acceptance of what is real. Neither of them stopped me as I walked away, and as I stepped outside into the late afternoon light, I felt something I had not felt in days, not relief, not victory, but a steady sense of balance, the kind that comes when everything returns to its proper place, not through force, but through the simple act of truth revealing itself exactly when it needs to.